Hey guys, welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about rogue picks for Beyblade X. What does that mean? What are they good for? What are the advantages and disadvantages? Rogue picks are some of my favorite for Beyblade X, and I wanted to make a video about it, sort of talking about it, because I think they're sort of underutilized and they can provide sort of advantages in some ways that I think most people don't think about. So let's get into it. What is a rogue pick? So most people generally consider a rogue pick to be sort of non-meta, sort of on the fringe of what people would typically use, specifically in this case in terms of Beyblade at tournaments. But this is a term that's used inside other hobbies as well, including things like Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic, Pokemon. But rogue picks are basically just that. They're sort of on the fringe. They're sort of outside of the norm of what is typically considered to be meta. You may be asking yourself, if it's not considered to be meta, then what would be the point of using it? And that is a fair question. However, there are some advantages to using rogue picks. Obviously, there's some disadvantages as well. You're sort of working outside of what most people consider to be the meta. Obviously, there's always a little bit of fluctuation between sort of people's conversations on what actually is like the best of the best. But for the most part, anything that is not going to be at the very top of the tier list, most people would consider to be rogue picks. So things outside of S tier, sort of A tier, are probably going to fall into that category, which is totally fine. Like I said, I do think that there are some advantages to using things that are sort of outside of the meta, and let's get into what those things are. The biggest thing is that a lot of people plan and test based off of what is the meta. A lot of people, a lot of players fixate on the meta and don't tend to spend a lot of time working out what those rogue picks could potentially be good for in a tournament setting. So a lot of times when a release comes out and people are testing it and they sort of collectively decide that it's probably not towards the top of the tier list, most people are going to put that to the side, and if they are regular tournament goers, a lot of them are going to end up using sort of, the typical sort of top of the tier list blades. But what that does, it opens a gateway for you to be able to bring those sort of lower tier things, especially as the meta progresses. Because let's, for example, Leon Claw is something that came out a good while ago at this point. Like we're going on pushing a year pretty soon. But the point is that for a lot of people that tested that blade and then dropped it, a lot of them haven't gone back and revisited that despite the meta having shifted, new releases coming out. So that blade could potentially be a good counter for something that is specifically at the top of the meta right now. For example, Buster, I think, has been at the top of the tier list for quite a while now in terms of attack options, and I think Leon Claw has a pretty good counter for that. It's much more balanced, it has better stamina, and if you can avoid getting KO'd, it generally does a pretty good job of outspinning it. Same thing with Phoenix Wing. Leon Claw does a good job at matching up against that as well. Just because it's less recoily, it has a pretty good chance of outspinning Phoenix Wing, despite the weight variance. That's not to say that rogue picks don't have weaknesses. A lot of times they don't match up against a specific type very well. Things like Phoenix Wing are pretty balanced against a lot of different typings, but Leon Claw, again, for example, doesn't do particularly well against things like Chain or Scythe or even Wizard Rod. But if you're taking a deck that is comprised mostly of rogue picks, it's going to potentially throw your opponent sort of off guard because they're not going to know how to match up sort of their deck. So if you guys aren't familiar, when going to tournaments, you typically have a deck of 3 Beyblades, and when you're in a match, you pick an order 1 through 3, and you use them in that order. So you would do match 1, match 2, match 3, and you would go through that using them in that order. So you do this outside of sort of your opponent's view. You both sort of can inspect each other's blades, and then you sort of pick an orientation 1 through 3, and then you start the match. If it doesn't hit the point for the win, so let's say you're going to 4 points. If you don't hit 4 points, you end up reshuffling and reordering your deck. But the reason why I think that sort of deck format works for rogue picks so well is because let's say you bring Leon Claw, you bring Viper Tail, and you bring Sphinx, for example, and your opponent hasn't extensively tested these sort of rogue picks, or maybe they tested them a while back and haven't really messed with them a whole lot since, they're not going to know necessarily how to orient their deck against yours. So, for example, they have Buster, Rod, and Phoenix, and you have Leon, uh, Sphinx, and Viper Tail. They can maybe potentially work out what you're trying to do with it based on the build that you're using in terms of parts, but you're going to have a much easier time knowing how to orient your deck, because I'm under the assumption that you have tested these rogue picks pretty heavily against the meta. You're going to know how to orient your deck against what he's picking to give yourself the most favorable odds of winning versus your opponent, who is using these meta picks that maybe has, fixated on the meta, maybe hasn't tested against some of these rogue picks. Maybe you have some builds that are uncommon even for sort of rogue picks. They're going to look at that and they're going to sort of end up guesstimating what they think their orientation should be. So you could end up having sort of an advantage in terms of deck orientation. And I think there's an assumption that a Beyblade has to be universally good against a lot of things, or that you should sort of prioritize the things that are good against a lot of things. And if you're really focusing on trying to use the most optimal blades, then the top of the tier list in terms of meta is probably a pretty safe bet. However, the advantages of being able to know what blades you're using are going to be good against your opponent, and then potentially not knowing what this rogue pick is that you've put into your deck is matched up against, or what it's going to be good against, can give you a pretty good edge. So more often than not, I don't end up running a deck that is all rogue picks, just because it's undeniable that there's a lot of utility in some of the top tier stuff, things like Wizard Rod, things like Phoenix Swing, things like Tyranno Beat. Being able to mix in one rogue pick can sort of throw them off, because a lot of times they just don't know what it's good against. Like, I use Leon Claw a lot. A lot of players don't know what it matches up well against. Same thing with things like Viper Tail. I've tested Viper, quite a bit as well. That's another one of my favorite sort of rogue picks, and it's good against a lot of different things, even things that are towards the top of the tier list. So if there's a specific Beyblade that you like and you want to use, spend time testing it against the things at the top of the tier list in terms of the meta, and see if you can find one thing that it's good for. If it can beat one of the top tier blades pretty consistently, that's enough, I think, to be able to slot it into your deck. So if it's good against Phoenix Swing, if it's good against Wizard Rod, if it's good against Buster, if it's good against Tyranno Beat or Shark or any of the other sort of top utilized blades, then it's probably going to be okay to slot into your deck. You really want to build your deck around that rogue pick as well. So if it's good against one specific thing, then your other picks maybe need to have a little bit more utility. Like I said, if there's something that you really like, I would say use it. Try to figure out what it's good against in terms of the meta, and it can be to your advantage. Like I said, there's a lot of players that don't test a lot of these blades that get dropped from the meta just because people don't think they're optimal, and in most cases they're right, they're not. However, if you can find one or two things that it's really good at, that's all you need, and then you can build your deck around that. So that's what a lot of players do outside of Beyblade into other hobbies. Let's say you want to use a rogue pick in a video game or in a card game or whatever, they'll fixate on that pick and try to build the deck or the character or whatever around it in order to give it as much utility as possible and the best chances of winning. So anyway, I'm very interested to know what everybody thinks of this. What are your favorite rogue picks? Let me know down in the comments. Hit the like for the algorithm. It helps a ton. Subscribe if you haven't already for future Beyblade content. And if you want more guide videos, feel free to check out my playlist at the end of this video. And thanks again for watching. I will see you all in the next one.